When food was scarce and the harvest failed, medieval people didn't just sit around and starve. They got very creative. Forget fancy feasts or royal banquets. This is what kept real people alive when survival was on the line. From acorn bread to boiled weeds, here are 10 medieval famine foods that were weird, wild, and life-saving. Acorn bread, when nuts became necessity. In tough times, acorns were lifesavers. Yes, those things squirrels hoard. Medieval people gathered them, soaked them to remove the bitter tannins, ground them into flour and baked a type of bread. It wasn't fluffy or fancy. It was dense, dark and slightly bitter, like nature's protein bar. Removing tannins was key. Botched batches could cause stomach pain, or worse. Still, this was a cheap, abundant food when wheat was too expensive or just gone. In places like Scandinavia and the Alps, entire communities relied on acorn flour during crop failures. Imagine a world where oak trees were your emergency pantry. Modern foragers still swear by it, with enough soaking. Sure, it won't win any bake-offs, but when winter hits and your grain bins are empty, a hot loaf of survival sounds just fine. Pottage, the eternal stew. Medieval kitchens had one rule: never empty the pot. Pottage was a never-ending stew where peasants added anything edible: beans, barley, scraps, herbs, maybe a stray beet, over a fire that never stopped burning. It was the original perpetual soup, the broth thickened with time, taking on a life and smell of its own. Each day's pottage was a new remix of leftovers and whatever the garden or forest coughed up. When meat was scarce, roots and grains bulked it up. If famine hit, even weeds, fish bones, or dried peas made it in. Some monks recorded recipes that sounded more like survival spells than meals. But pottage wasn't just food, it was culture. People gathered around it, gossiped over it, and hoped it would keep them alive until the next harvest. Think of it as the medieval slow cooker, with none of the convenience and all of the mystery. Nettles. Sting now, thank later. If you've ever brushed against stinging nettles, you know they're not exactly inviting. But medieval peasants saw them as leafy green lifelines. When famine hit, they boiled nettles to kill the sting and turned them into soups, teas, and stews. Rich in iron, vitamin C, and protein, nettles were nutritious and surprisingly tasty when handled right. Herbal texts praised them for treating arthritis and infections. Peasants called them the poor man's spinach. Monks even grew them in garden patches on purpose. Plus, nettles were everywhere. They grew in ditches, fields, even castle walls. Of course, gathering them required tough hands or brave children. Some records suggest that nettle soup saved lives during food shortages in early spring, when stored crops ran out. Today, you'll find nettles at upscale health food stores. Back then, they were the sting you endured to stay alive. Grass peas, the paralysing protein. Grass peas, also known as Lathyrus sativus, were high in protein, drought-resistant, and tragically, toxic if eaten in large quantities. During prolonged famine, especially in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, people relied heavily on them. They were cheap, easy to grow, and could survive harsh weather. Perfect famine food, right? Well, there's a catch. Too much grass pea causes lathyrism, a neurodegenerative condition that led to irreversible paralysis, especially in the legs. But when it was the only thing keeping you alive, paralysis felt like a risk worth taking. Monks warned of the curse of the blue leg, a nickname for lathyrism's telltale limp. Still, people boiled and mashed the peas into porridges and cakes. Some tried soaking them or mixing with other grains to reduce toxicity. Today, grass peas are making a comeback, with breeding techniques that remove the toxin. But back then, it was walk now, crawl later. Bark flour, baking with trees. Yes, you read that right. People made flour out of trees. In Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe, famine-stricken communities scraped the soft inner bark from birch or pine trees, dried it, ground it into powder, and added it to flour. This bark bread was dense, bitter, and about as chewy as a leather boot. But it was calories, and in the Middle Ages, calories were survival. Birch bark in particular was slightly sweet and fibrous. Herbalists believed it had medicinal value too, helping with stomach ailments and joint pain. Some even toasted it like flatbread. There's archaeological evidence of bark flour dating back to Viking times, and it was still being used as recently as the 1800s. While not delicious, bark flour gave poor families something to eat when the grain bins were empty and the fields were dead. It's like turning your firewood into food and somehow making it edible. Boiled weeds, the backyard buffet. In desperate times, even the weeds got invited to dinner. Chickweed, dandelion greens, sorrel, fat hen. If it grew, it was food. Boiled, mashed, or tossed into pottage, these plants weren't exactly gourmet, but they were edible and often surprisingly nutritious. Medieval people knew what modern foragers brag about on Instagram today. Herbal guides and monastic texts listed dozens of wild greens to gather before they bolted or turned bitter. Still, not all weeds were created equal. Some were laxatives. Others tasted like regret. One 13th century English record even warns, "Boil thrice, lest it bite the gut." Translation, cook it real good, or prepare for a wild ride. The good news, these greens were everywhere. The bad news, eating them felt like chewing on damp lawn clippings. But when your stomach's growling louder than your neighbour's pigs, you take what you can get, roots, shoots, and all. Animal bones, broth of the brave. When meat was a distant memory, bones became the next best thing. Medieval peasants didn't waste a thing, and bones were boiled, reboiled, and then boiled again until they gave up every last bit of flavour. The resulting broth, though thin, was rich in collagen, minerals, and comfort. It was often the base of pottage or served alone with wild herbs or stale bread. Marrow was considered a delicacy, and even cracked open skulls weren't off the table, literally. In hospitals and monasteries, bone broth was given to the sick and weak. It was medicine, meal, and miracle in one pot. If it looked like it had bones, it went in the cauldron. Rats, pigeons, or even the occasional hedgehog. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival. Think of it as the medieval protein shake, just with fewer bananas and more femurs. Fermented grains, sour but satisfying. In a time before fridges, fermentation wasn't just a culinary trend, it was a necessity. When grains started to go bad, peasants didn't toss them. They soaked, soured, and slurped them instead. One popular result? A kind of sour porridge made from fermented oats or barley. In Scotland, it was called sowens. In Eastern Europe, it turned into kvass. In Russia, it even became a fizzy drink. These weren't exactly crowd pleasers, but they were full of probiotics and energy. Some monks believed fermented grain could revive a man from death's doorstep, or at least stop him from keeling over until spring. The longer it sat, the more pungent it got. Think vinegar meets oatmeal. But in the dead of winter, fermented grain was a strange sort of luxury. Sour, weirdly alive, and strangely addictive. Medieval gut health? Accidentally ahead of its time. Insects, protein with a crunch. When crops failed and livestock died, some medieval communities turned to insects. Beetles, grubs, locusts, and even roasted ants made appearances on peasant plates, especially in famine-stricken areas or regions hit by plagues of bugs. Church authorities were weirdly divided on the issue. Some said insects were unclean, others said, hey, they're not technically meat, so dig in. People roasted them, ground them into flour, or ate them whole. Locusts in particular were treated like mini drumsticks in parts of southern Europe and the Middle East. Rich in protein and easy to catch, insects were the medieval protein bar, just one with legs. Sure, it's not ideal dinner fare, but when the pantry is empty and bugs are literally falling from the sky, you stop being picky. You start being resourceful. Clay and dirt, desperation on a spoon. Okay, this one's not recommended, but it happened. In the absolute worst famines, people turned to the earth itself, literally. The practice of geophagy, eating clay or dirt, is well documented in history, especially during starvation. Clay was believed to fill the stomach, provide trace minerals, and even ease nausea. In France, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe, famine survivors described eating white clay, chalk, or ash to quiet the hunger. Some even baked dirt into cakes or mixed it with bark flour. Of course, this had health consequences. Parasites, poisoning, and malnutrition were common. But when there was truly nothing left to eat, a handful of dirt was better than nothing at all. It wasn't food. It was defiance, a way of saying, "I'm not done yet." If that's not a testament to human survival, nothing is. These weren't just foods, they were lifelines. When crops failed and cupboards were bare, medieval people didn't give up. They boiled weeds, ground tree bark, chewed bugs, and yes, even ate dirt, just to see another day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was genius. These survival foods weren't about flavour, they were about resilience. Every nettle, acorn, and stinky stew was a reminder that even in the harshest times, humans find a way to adapt, improvise, and keep going. So the next time you grumble about your fridge being empty, remember, at least you're not digging up roots or chasing crickets with a stick. Would you survive a medieval famine? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this historical deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten food lore from the past. Because trust us, medieval people knew how to eat ugly and live to tell the tale.